listening to Let's Talk Sustainable Business.
Hi, my name is Barbara Mendes-George, and I'm a sustainability communications expert based in Brussels, Belgium. It's a pleasure to welcome you to this edition of Let's Talk Sustainable Business, a series brought to you by the Conference Board. This is the second instalment of our two-part episode with Marie Brueser, Corporate Venture Manager at EIT Food. So if you haven't listened to part one yet, please do go back into our catalogue to listen to it first. Welcome back, Marie. I really enjoyed our conversation in part one.
Same here. I'm looking forward to part two.
So in part one, we talked about your work at EIT Food, which startups you've been connecting with bigger companies, and the impact that EU policy and other policy globally is having on companies' approach to sustainability. In part two, I'd love to talk to you more about policy relating to food and sustainable agriculture specifically, as well as discussing EIT Food's Consumer Observatory, which is the central hub for European consumer insights on agri-food topics. So on policy, the EU's Farm to Fork strategy is at the heart of the European Green Deal. Can you summarize the policy to our listeners and explain its sustainability goals?
Yes, happy to. So like you say, the Farm to Fork strategy is at the heart of the European Green Deal. As the name suggests, it's strongly linked to food and agriculture. And so it was published in May 2020 with quite some clear targets in there. And you'll notice that these are strongly agriculture focused. So by 2030, we want to reduce pesticide use by 50%. We want to reduce nutrient losses by 50%. We want to reduce fertilizer use by 20%, right? So that's all the arable ones. So we really want to reduce anything we're putting on our fields. At the same time, when we look at the animal world, we want to reduce the sale of antimicrobials for farmed animals and aquaculture also by 50%. So we're also halving that. And we really want to have 25% of all farmland be organic. So these are kind of the main big targets of the Farm to Fork strategy. Clearly, there's a lot here to be done. The focus is on farmers to do a lot. I think you mentioned it in part one, right? We've seen farmers be a little bit unhappy because actually, while these goals obviously sound fantastic, and they are, there hasn't been enough information on how to actually make them come to life and how, right, if we're not putting in 50% of our pesticides, of our nutrients onto the field, well, what do we do instead to ensure that we have the food that we actually want to grow here in Europe? So it's been causing a little bit of kind of strife there. And at the same time, it's really driven innovation. So here at EIT Food, we've seen an uptake of startups doing bio inputs and coming up with kind of biostimulants. So really anything that you can then still use in your field that is much more in line with nature, that works with nature instead of against nature. And that's been getting a huge boost. And so that's been fantastic. And so it comes with a big drive and innovation in that area. At the same time, right, of course, it also looks at more, but those are really at the heart of the strategy. But we're also looking at producing healthier foods, reducing food loss and waste, and looking at the supply chain as a whole. If we think back to May 2020, most of us were at home. So the COVID pandemic was obviously really big on our minds. And so hence talking about supply chains and really where do we source our food from? And also looking at how to work with nature and that renewed sense of, okay, actually we're using a lot of antibiotics in humans. How can we also reduce that in our farmed animals and in aquaculture? But since then, some work has happened already. So in July 2021, the EU Code of Conduct on Responsible Food Business and Marketing Practices came out. So that was one of the tangible kind of first steps. And that's for SMEs and corporates. It's different, obviously, frameworks for the smaller than the larger companies. But that's really looking for individual commitments to create those healthy and balanced diets, to prevent food waste and loss, and to look at the creation of a more climate neutral food system by 2050, and obviously also supporting circularity, as well as, and I think that one's really important, the decent work for everyone. And that's a voluntary framework that you can join to get some guidance on how to implement that. So it's really, there's a lot there on farmers and the tangible, measurable things. But beyond that, it's really making a better food system.
Great. Thank you for providing the nuance there with kind of what's going on and what is happening on the policy side to try and make this happen. As a kind of not food expert, you mentioned that, obviously if you're reducing pesticides, etc., certain things are going to have to substitute it. I'm just curious to hear, and I'm sure some of our listeners aren't food experts either. So when you're banning something to substitute it with something else, what are some of the solutions at the moment that might come to market that could substitute pesticides and other harmful substances?
Mhm. Yeah, so one is, let's say, yeah, so biostimulants is a lot. So they might be algae based. And I think you had a really great company on this podcast
We did,
as
yeah.
well on that. So
Origin by Ocean, check it out.
there we go. So that's a startup as well that would fit right into our remit, by the way. But so basically, yeah, for example, right, using algae that's sourced sustainably in the oceans to then add to your land, which has a lot of stimulating effects. That has really good nutrients in it already. So things like that. There's also different types of growing practices, right? So this goes back to regenerative agriculture again, where we look at how we can grow crops in the best way for the soils, but also thinking of generations to come. And that can be by putting different crops next to each other, and then having a row on the side that pulls all the insects to it, and then there'll be less of them in the field. So practices as well as different inputs can come in here. But we're looking for more solutions. So if you're an innovator at home and you have an idea, please go for it, launch yourself into the space, because yeah, plenty of solutions needed.
You heard it here. Innovators, reach out.
Yes, please.
Great. So we've touched a little bit about how kind of health is linked to obviously creating a more sustainable agricultural system. And sticking to policy, I wanted to talk to you about one of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Number 2 is zero hunger. How do you see larger companies and startups doing their part to contribute to this goal, and maybe expanding the question further to other stakeholders like consumers, NGOs? What can all these different types of organizations do to contribute to zero hunger?
Perfect. Yes, let's talk about the SDGs. So when we look at them, let's zoom out because you mentioned SDG 2, zero hunger. But I think when we zoom out and look at all the SDGs, food is really at the heart of pretty much all of them, right? We're talking life below water, which obviously aquaculture comes in. We're talking life on land. Of course, agriculture comes in. Climate action. A third of emissions happen in the agriculture space and the food system. So how can we change that to then actually mitigate climate change? But we're also looking at education, for example, right? So if you're going to school hungry, you're not going to learn as much. So I think food is at the heart of the SDGs, even though, of course, zero hunger spells it out really clearly. And there's lots to be done, but there's also lots of potential here. And I think going with startups first, they often have it at the core of what they do. So they want to create solutions. They're small and nimble. They don't want to become a part of the problem. They're thinking of our economies in new ways. They're thinking of new business models. They're thinking of how they set themselves up. And so there's models there where they make sure that they source from local or regional setups where they don't fly things across the world, looking more at that climate action piece. But they're also looking at fair wages, for example, which I think is a really important one here, that everybody that is part of that supply chain gets paid actively in the right amount so that they can in turn buy the food that they need. So I think that's one. And again, startups have this at their core because they're small and nimble and can change that. When you're looking at the bigger companies, obviously that's harder to do. They have bigger processes, they have that bigger setup. But what's nice about them is that they have a huge reach. So anything you can do has a big ripple effect. And I think one, and you'll hear it, but is collaboration, right? Of course, work with the startups, learn from them, get inspired by them, but work together because you can have big levers there. I think the other one is also reducing food waste and food loss, right? So food loss happening on farm level, food waste being anything after that. So including in your homes, for example, but also in manufacturing, as well as coming back to fair pay in the supply chains. And then I think it's not just about calories, right? And this is a very European-centric answer, I will admit, but one is obviously having enough food for everybody, but the other thing is having a healthy food that is nourishing. And I think that's also then down to the companies to create that food for us. And I think they are looking at that a lot more. So we're seeing that reduction in sugar levels and salt levels being really important, also being driven by the Nutri-Score, right, which has also then driven more action on company sides because they want to be more healthy, because they want to have that A sticker on the front of pack. So it's really looking at your supply chain as well as that healthier food. I think those are important ones. There's also share models. So there's a startup or scale up in Germany called Share, where they sell water, but they also sell snacks, they also sell other products. And basically, when you buy one, they also pay for water somewhere else where someone in need is. And so these things can be really important as well. I think going beyond that, I think you asked about NGOs as well. So they obviously come
NGOs, yeah.
in. They come in with a neutral voice. So that neutral voice is really important because they can help advocate for topics, they can help communicate them, they can help measure in a fair, neutral way what's going on. I'm a big believer. I'm a data person. So when you measure it, you can see it, you can change it, you can report on it, you can make it better. I think that's important because if you don't know what you're tackling, you're not going to know where to go. And I think also creating those partnerships is on the NGOs, I think, as well. Possibly my favorite one, though, is really the consumers. So and that's every single one of us, right? We're all consumers of the food system. Hopefully we all eat a few times a day. But there, I think one is again, every time you pay for something, you're voting for something or you're voting against something else, right? And I think sometimes we forget that our vote in that sense is actually really important. And one is in the supermarket, of course. And I think there, going back to labels, I think that is an important one. So if you can buy the product that's fair trade versus the non-fair trade one, or choose your favorite label. And at times I think you think, oh, that's a few cents, it's quite a few cents more. But I actually, when you measure that up over a year, right? Say bananas, I think, is often the example. So if you buy the fair trade banana over the other one, on the day itself, you go to the supermarket, it seems like quite a steep step up. But when you actually measure that up over a year, you're going to pay, I don't know, 35 euros more to buy the fair trade one, which actually, to me, sounds quite affordable. And so again, that's somewhere where you're voting every time with your money. Same as in the restaurant. That for me is a really big one. Your feedback chain is so small because what you order goes to the kitchen and they see every night there's only that many tables they serve. They see what they sold or what they had to waste. And so through that, you can really advocate for a more sustainable product, more regional product. You can vote for, I don't know, more vegetarian products, vegan products, whatever it is you want to go for. You have that really strong voice there. So I think that's an important one. Which is looking at that reducing waste side, because I think there's a big lever here. In Europe alone, we waste 58 million tons of food a year. That is so big that I can't imagine it, but when you break it down per inhabitant, that's 131 kilograms of food a year that are wasted for every single one of us, and that really adds up. And actually, more than half of that is in your home. So is that food that you buy but then end up throwing out? So I think that food, if you imagine that going elsewhere, that's a really big lever, because it turns into 10% of food that's being created that doesn't actually reach people, that doesn't reach consumers, and that's a lot. And that, looking at that zero hunger, if you redistribute that elsewhere, you can reach a lot of people. So I think those are quite big ones, that where you're not too small to do something, right? You as an individual have a lot of power, actually. I think that's an important one for me on that one.
Some terrifying statistics, but a good message. Thank you, Marie. And as someone who yesterday went to the Vegan Summerfest in Ghent, here in Belgium, which is, I quote, the biggest vegan festival in the Benelux, it's really interesting to go to spaces like that where people are creating alternatives. It's not always going to be necessarily more sustainable, but to be in a place where people are really creating interesting solutions, that is nice as a consumer, to go to a place where you can see that in action.
Yes, correct. And that's part of it, right? Like, start with yourself and then you can bring it to your friends. So obviously,
Exactly.
working in the food space, the conferences I go to tend to be quite fun because I can try things, I can eat things, and sometimes I can bring them home and share with my friends. Sometimes they taste good, sometimes they don't, but they can also make you think about the food system, about what we might be able to eat in the future, what might taste good, and how we might just create a different system. So I think that's important as well. What can you share with others and just spark that little thought in their mind?
Great. And talking about another stakeholder, what message do you have for policymakers to help create a truly sustainable food system and reach zero hunger?
So policymakers have a really big role to play. At EIT Food, we have that link to the policymakers, to the MEPs. So what we can do is take what we hear from our members and bring that directly to the policymakers. And we do that, for example, with a protein diversification think tank, where we have representatives from NGOs, from universities, from research institutes, but also from corporates come together and actually share policy recommendations. And I think my wish for the policymakers is that they listen to that they open their doors and take in really diverse views from their stakeholders, and not just from the biggest names out there, but also from the smaller ones, and really importantly, also from the startups. Because I think I mentioned it in our part one, but startups offer this view into the future. Our policies do not, right? They are slower because the policies need to look at all the risks out there, and that's really good. But the startups are already breaking waves for the future. And when you listen to them and hear what roadblocks they have and can take that into consideration to create a more nimble ecosystem and to drive those innovations so that we can become more sustainable faster, I think that'd be really important. So for me, it's really about, again, collaboration and talking to each other and making a more inclusive decision-making process.
Absolutely. And I think in part one, you said that startups provide a lens into the future, which is a really nice turn of phrase and yeah, a very interesting point of view, actually. I don't think people always consider startups like that. Like you said before, it could be a scruffy 20-year-old bringing together some ideas. Actually, it's much more than that.
By the time, again, you read about them and you know about that 20-year-old, they've done a lot of work before. And those years before that you haven't seen, they're the ones where they made that groundwork and where they put these things into place so that they can become that name you then read about. So yes, they do offer that lens.
Great. So in the introduction, I mentioned EIT Food's Consumer Observatory. Could you tell us a bit more about that and what it does?
Yes. So in essence, it's asking 20,000 people from 18 countries what they think. Right? So EIT Food, again, with our reach, with our ecosystem, what we do is we get consumer insights from organizations across the food system. And we ask them questions about current topics that are important. We also ask them about their insights about policies, and a really big one is about trust in the food system. And so we do this like we always work at EIT Food in a consortium. So we work with others from NGOs, from research institutes, from universities, with corporates that help us advise on this and that help us choose the questions to ask. And then in turn, these reports that we make can be used to gain knowledge, to inform strategy, to offer guidance to educators, to policymakers, as well as to other businesses. But it's really that source of information. And coming back to the trust tracker, because I think that's a quite nice one that makes it a bit tangible. The trust tracker we run since 2018. And so every year we put out a report on the trust that consumers have in the food system. And for me, that's really quite shocking because this year, so the 2023 report that just came out, says that only 45% of Europeans have trust in their food system, and only 36% have confidence that their food is produced in a sustainable way. So that's 2/3 of us who think, okay, our food system and the way we produce it is not sustainable, which shows us we have a lot of work to do.
Mm-hmm. Very interesting. And how should companies or other stakeholders use that as a resource? I'm guessing on a theme that's run throughout education, communication, but in what areas have you seen companies use that as a resource?
Yeah, so one is use the reports that we have, right? So go through them, see what's in there. If you're working in that sector, that can be a really good source of information, whether you're company, business, or policymaker. I think the other thing, and maybe again a tangible one here, is regenerative agriculture, which we've also talked about a lot, but that's because it's one of our priorities at EIT Food. But we did a study on that recently, and we saw that people think of it as a positive term. They don't quite know what it is, and they think it's organic and maybe a little bit better, which is almost there. But what that tells us is that, okay, there needs to be a communication piece, but what they also saw was that actually consumers didn't care too much if it's better for the soil, because that doesn't make them more willing to buy it. So that means that in our communication about it, in our marketing, let's not talk about soil health and about the bugs in the soil that we help to promote, but let's talk about maybe the nutrient density of the food, because that is actually what they care about. And that is why they might want to also pay more for that product, because they're excited for that nutrient density. So I think it's using it like that. We also had a startup do a study with it. And so this was a startup that made plant-based shrimp. And they came in with all of their passion and their enthusiasm because they saw that actually what was happening in the oceans is unsustainable. We can't farm this. What are we doing? We need different alternatives. And so they went out to create this delicious product. And then they did the study with us in the Consumer Observatory. And they found that actually consumers were not that bothered about the sustainability of prawns. So they weren't too bothered about how they were grown, but what they cared about was the potential heavy metal contamination of the prawns they buy.
Oh, okay.
And so that was something that the startup hadn't considered, but obviously they can tap into that. And what they also found was that actually consumers love that they don't have to peel these. So those are two things at the startup. They had their lens on, they have their problem in mind, and they wouldn't have built their marketing campaign around that. And now they can pivot that and reach the consumers and actually obviously have a better business model for it and reach more people for it. So it's really around that. So you can commission studies with us, you can look at different topics for it, but you can also use what's there. And I think it's really about planning next steps, planning strategies, as well as, again, marketing, communication, education. Like you say, it's a really big one. I think everybody is part of the food system, so we need to talk about it and dive into that.
I mean, yeah, it sounds like a great resource for if you're thinking of launching a new communications campaign or strategy, as you say, but also, which is a topic that always comes up in this podcast, if you want to avoid greenwashing as well. You know, people see food in a very particular way, and I think, yeah, we as people, if you're someone working in the food industry, you might think this is definitely what motivates people, but what you're showing in the examples that you've given is what motivates people isn't always what you think initially. So yeah, check it out, I guess, to make sure that your communications is targeted and that you're speaking about these things properly and accurately.
Yeah, and also do look at the facts, right?
Yeah,
I mean, don't want to talk about heavy metal contamination when actually the facts don't back it up. So yes, so I think factual communication is key. But yes, I mean, the food space is also like all sustainability areas, there is greenwashing happening. And I think it's a really fine line that you need to be aware of and that you don't want to fall into, and you need to be factual in it. And hopefully some of our tools can help you do that.
Great. Wonderful. So to wrap up, my final question: what advice would you give to someone who's working in the food or agricultural space who wants to incorporate more sustainability into their career, whether that's someone, you know, working for a big company that wants to make a change, an innovator that could maybe come to you for ideas? What advice would you give?
Love this question. It's so big. I have so many ideas.
So big.
I think one, right, going back to the consumers. So just as individuals, let's not waste food. I think that's an easy one we can all do. Let's vote cleverly with our money when we buy anything. But if you're working in this space, I think there's one in your company or even any company, if you want to look there, I think there's things that you can do where you look at how you can make substitutions, right? You don't need to dive into the big budgets, but think about, for example, if you're taking someone on a meal out for work, right? You have a company dinner. Instead of going to the restaurant that you always go to, look for that sustainable alternative that is maybe sourcing their products from a regenerative farm, or maybe that only does vegan food. Just look at different things like that and then see where you can actually make money through becoming or using those sustainable practices. So another fact, the World Resource Institute, so the WRI, did a study again on food waste and loss, because it's a really big topic. But for every company, the $1 that they put in to prevent food waste, they actually make or they save $14. So you put in one and you get 14 back. And facts like this mean that internally also you're going to be able to actually do things and to drive things. And what I like about the food waste one is that it's something that we all, regardless what sector we're in, we can implement. But obviously, if you are in the food space, do look at EIT Food, see if you want to join as a member, if you want to incorporate startups, especially when you have a clear sustainable strategy or you have clear challenges internally that you want to address. then we can be a really good partner to help you see what road might get you there fast, but also connect you to other stakeholders that you can either learn from or learn with or incorporate practices into what you're doing. So do reach out. I would very happily like to hear from you.
Collaboration is key, as we said. Thank you, Marie. It would be really good if you could share that WRI study as well, because I'm fascinated to hear how spending $1 in food prevents, leads to $14 for the company. Very interesting. So thank you, Marie, for joining us today for part 2. And thanks to our listeners. If you enjoyed this episode, please remember to subscribe to this podcast series and explore the entire catalogue of podcast programming from the Conference Board by visiting our website at tcb.org/podcasts. See you next time.
That was Let's Talk Sustainable Business.